Do pardon me if this ends up being a bit of a rambling mess, by the way. This came about as inspiration drawn from the Lotus Eaters lads talking about men and their problems, and I'll do a separate video on that one, and Curtis Yarvin, aka Mensch's Molbug, being on trigonometry and him explaining the current state of the world through his thought process. And I was watching the premiere, so the chat was full of fans thinking Curtis would fry them alive, but that's not his nature. He's very diplomatic, actually, in his approach. But Francis did ask him, okay, we've heard your critique, what is your solution? And his reply was, oh, the problem is we're not in a monarchy. Now, I've read his works, watched God knows how many hours of the man, so I understand his leap. Though if you're not at least ready to take the leap, you'd likely think he's a madman. And as such, I might end up making a series, Why Society is Losing Its Mind. So there are 3 axioms in my critique. 1, we're not in a monarchy. 2, nothing in our world is natural. And 3, we lack low time preference leadership. And lastly, extensive use of the following Thomas Sowell quote, there is no such thing as solutions, what you have are trade-offs. If you look at the old Aristotelian description of government, democracy, rule of the many, oligarchy, rule of the few, monarchy, rule of the one. In the present day, however, due to the last century and up to the present day, this view has become very warped. Now it looks more like this, rule of the many, populism, the oligarchical rule of the few is democracy, and rule of the one is a dictatorship. Now, democracy comes from the Greek demos, the people, and kratos, power, in an almost brutal sense. The milder form of this you would find in archy, which implies leadership rather than rule. The modern consensus, due to the previous century, is to assume one-man rule to automatically imply tyrant. Monarchy is the father-like rule in the interest of the common good, whereas monocracy is the one-man tyranny. But again, this is not how we view government today. What fascinates me about democracy is nothing about it actually works as intended. Let's take South Africa, for example, where democracy has utterly destroyed the place. The assumption behind democracy is the people have a choice and the representatives enact the will of the people. Why on earth would you do this when the people have no idea what the system of government looks like and those who the masses elect haven't the faintest clue, intellect, or morality to lead the nation? Now, aside from your feelings of fairness, what exactly makes this change beneficial in any quantifiable metric? Let's be honest, reading that aloud nowadays will make you laugh because it's so far removed from the real world, it actually isn't even funny. But you've given the people a choice, at least on paper anyway, but all that you've really done is fraction power in an unusual way and you've birthed factions. Instantly, your system has spawned animus, and that's by design. You've created nothing more than a system filled with humans who will now compete for power. And in this form of government, you're relying on the people to take part in the system, which means you're charging the people with an enormous amount of political activation, and so your job as a politician is to sway them, which means propagandize, distract, and deflect. And the propaganda in our time is in everything, and people are becoming sick of it, and it's causing an enormous amount of tension. Democracy is nothing more than the means to do a few things, for example, decoupling itself from accountability. The way people think of accountability in a democracy is the capacity to vote people out of power. Does this actually do anything? No, for a few simple reasons. For one, the state apparatus is enormous, and your vote does not permeate anything, let alone influence it. The idea that the politicians actually run the government is a laughable absurdity. Anyone paying attention knows this, which means the very concept that democracy rests on is already detached and broken. Aaron McIntyre had a good post about this on Twitter. To acknowledge a problem with your ruling class, you must first acknowledge that you are ruled. You must admit that elections do not, in and of themselves, install or remove those that wield power. I don't think at this point anyone would disagree with this, which is why the whole concept of voting is nothing but this giant coping mechanism designed to keep the corrupting influence out of the limelight and pacify the population with a smokescreen of choice, but ultimately nothing whatsoever changes. Which leads us to the core of the problem, corruption. Voting can only attempt to remove the corrupted, not the corruption. There is a reason why Erik van Conner-Ledden said democracy is the road to tyranny and Hans Hermann Hoppe said it's soft communism. Again, South Africa is a perfect example of this. Democracy exists merely as a selection mechanism that implies a sense of right to govern, a form of legitimacy. The problem here is that there is no morality tied to this whatsoever, no guide of how politicians should behave, no code of honor or conduct at all. No, you're just elected, you're completely detached from the people, and you're never going to be held accountable for anything. Politicians are thus free to do pretty much anything as long as the power apparatus approves and they don't rock the boat. Case in point, America's current administration. The idea of the American Constitution doing anything to mitigate this is laughable. It's not viewed with favor among the American political elites. It's an obstacle. Someone in my comment section did ask me, why has Asia done so much better with the system than Africa? Simple. Asia is full of Asians. Intellect development and resources aside, their culture is vastly different and they have a very high degree of honor in the social system, a strong focus on how to behave in a way that facilitates the growth and stability of their nations. They come from advanced empires and dynasties, for heaven's sakes. That is the biggest hurdle a lot of Westerners need to clear, letting go of the universal man mythos and understand how different people in the world and their rulers interact with power and its holders, which leads us neatly to our next step, understanding how power works and the myth of centrism. The way democracy is sold is that factions can meet in the middle and engage in debate, as if they're the English Parliament of old. No one in their right mind thinks this is how the process works, especially given how rich politicians get these days. I've used this quote many times now from Robert Downey Jr., 19th century Presbyterian Baptist, who said that Northern conservatism doesn't conserve anything. It moves in the shadows of radicalism only to resist the innovation, but ultimately it will acquiesce to it. It risks nothing serious for the sake of truth. It barks but no more. It exists only as a mechanism of exercise to be used by progressivism to keep it from becoming fat and lazy. That centrism zone is a complete myth. In reality, politicians don't make do with the power they have. No, they will hack democracy and simply attempt to accrue more power. It's not red and blue in this shade of purple in the middle. No, it's hard red and the invading blue orcish horde that come to steal from you. Simple as that. This is a zero-sum game. Any concession, no matter how small, is a win for them and a loss for you. And if you don't punch back, they will just keep coming back for more over and over again. And this is how the state keeps increasing its size and power. Easiest two ways to do that: scare the wits out of the population by claiming a threat to our democracy, or offer them pie-in-the-sky promises. The moment your state apparatus offers services and claim it can fix problems is the day your state can launch off on the road to tyrannical overload. And we all know why. Half the problems the government claims to be able to solve, they made to begin with. And so they make jobs to manage the problem, but never solve it. Why? Because it pays and it expands government. Now, a question we all have to ask ourselves is, how on earth do really stupid ideas become so popular? Well, at least amongst the mainstream class types, because we often hear there's an assault on meritocracy. And I think that's a bit of an inappropriate word to use, because its application in this sense is very anchored to a particular end goal. We often use this in the capitalistic kind of sense, best skilled or equipped for the task of doing the job, i.e. generating of profit, capital. But if you look at DEI, for example, then the best skilled or equipped for the task has nothing to do with anything, because the end goal is no longer profit, it's ticking a checklist. The merit is no longer skill, because the end goal is diversity. The merit now becomes gay and non-white. Curtis had a really good way of phrasing this. In the dictatorship sense, counter or threatening ideas are suppressed, but in the oligarchical sense, bad ideas are rewarded. So not only are bad ideas rewarded, but the accountability mechanism for them is decoupled. Thomas Sowell has a good quote about it as well. It's hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong. Although I would argue there is still suppression in our world, it comes from pointing out the blindingly obvious. What's rather jarring, though, is that we have a sizable chunk of the population who are not only completely oblivious to the blindingly obvious, they openly advocate for more of it and vote accordingly. And as much as I would like to believe a smarter population would make for better voting decisions, the problem is smarter people don't make for more moral politicians. And so, a proposed solution is a figure who holds absolute power, delegated to them. This removes the rewarding of bad ideas, which is based on political power, because the mechanism by which it perpetuates is now closed off, and the figure has no interest in rehashing it because they're objectively bad for his reign, and they would ultimately pay the price for it. Kings think long term. They have heirs to consider, and because their reign is secure, they're afforded more freedom to move, yet also they have more stake in the game, in a way that politicians never will. Their interests can be aligned with the people, whereas the politicians will only run contrary because they use the state to loot the people, not serve them. And yes, I know the Western mind is trained to think with insanely unhealthy obsession with freedom above all else, as sense and order collapses all around them, as they spiral off into a dystopian nightmare, but what would you rather have? A politician who never sees you, never interacts with you, cares absolutely nothing for the people or the nation, and they're focused solely on looting the place dry in their short stint, and are bought off by every big interest you can imagine as they leave the place in a mess. Meanwhile, you elect the next person who does the exact same thing as the state keeps bloating over and over again. Or would you rather have a king who is trained to rule, who might consider you his property or subject, but ultimately has no reason to see you scarred or damaged and has every incentive to see you succeed and grow because your success is best for his kingdom? I would like someone to explain to me how on earth do we have a system of government that's apparently approved of by the people at large, yet everyone who goes into it is either corrupt or becomes corrupt, and are thus considered by the population to be nothing but snakes who will lie their way into power and do everything they can to stay there. Explain to me how the system itself is good, but everyone and everything connected to it is detested. I will keep saying this. Anyone who believes in democracy is a cultist, because you can get the vast majority to agree with the most basic critiques of democracy, right up to the point of acknowledging that nothing about it actually works. But the moment you suggest getting rid of it, oh, they will become entranced and defend it with religious fervor. And if you happen to be someone who does that, maybe ask yourself why. No one wants to hear this, but democracy is a drug. You can see it's bad, you know it's bad, but you can't shake it because you think without it, it'll somehow get worse. The healthiest thing to do would be to acknowledge the fantasy, stop getting high, disassociate with the drug, and join the real world. Cheers for watching, and once again, I apologize for nothing.